maybe we've got to broaden out what we recommend to people. Say, it doesn't matter how you move your body, you just want to move it more, and find what actually works for you. But are there any sort of universal principles when it comes to movement that actually do work for all of us?
In terms of getting us to move? I mean, I go back to the simple, I mean, I think there's two basic impetuses that have, over millennia have been the basis for how and why people move. And one is because it's necessary, and the other is because it's fun. And for most people, fun involves social. Sometimes going for a run by yourself or a walk by yourself is meditative, and it's nice to be by yourself and you can think through a problem. But for most of us, we like to be with other people. And so that's why Park Run is so successful. It's social. Here in Cambridge, we have the November Project. Every Wednesday, people do these wonderful runs and they run up the stadium and they do all kinds of great stuff. Wow. We have, all around the world, there are various kinds of social events. There, dancing is social. Playing a game of, soccer or football is social. I mean, the list goes on, right? And there are many ways to do it socially. And I think, so that's critical. But that's never going to be enough for some folks. And exercise, physical activity used to be necessary in our lives. And that was the impetus that people had to get out and every day and do work. And so we need to find ways, without coercing them unethically, to make exercise, to make physical activity necessary. And because it's not appropriate to tell adults that they can't have the benefits of society unless they exercise, right? We need to help people help themselves. And I think the way to do that is through what's called a commitment contract. So let me go again back to education. In education, education works on a commitment contract basis for adults, right? So I'm a professor in a university where people pay ghastly sums to go to Harvard, right? I mean, I think the tuition is, and room and board and all that costs like $60,000 to $70,000 a year. That's full. Of course, most students don't end up paying that. I mean, the vast majority get financial aid. So don't worry. Most of my students are not fabulously wealthy, actually. Many of them are first generation students because we're lucky we have really good financial aid. But anyway, somebody's paying $60,000 to $70,000 every year for them to go to school. And there's some commitment from them to go to school. And what are they doing? They're having people like me torture them, right? I make them take exams, I make them read books, I make them stay up late at night studying, and if they don't do well, I give them a bad grade, which stigmatizes them for the rest of their life. But they do it willingly because they've signed a kind of a commitment contract, whereas they're paying money for me to make them do stuff which they know is good for them, which they otherwise wouldn't do for themselves. And we do all kinds of other commitment contracts in our world, and I think exercise should be part of that. We should find exercise. There are many. So there's a wonderful program called Stick.com. It's a website run through some economists. They used to be at Yale. I'm not sure if they're still at Yale, where you can basically pick either a carrot or a stick, right? And I describe this in the book because because there's a friend of mine in San Francisco who's been trying to lose weight. And she gave Stick.com, I think, $2,000. So not a small amount of money. And every week she agreed that she was going to walk a certain number of miles. And if she didn't get those miles in, and her husband was a referee, if she didn't do those miles, as affirmed by her husband, they would automatically send $50 that week to the National Rifle Association. That's the big association that tries to prevent gun control laws in the United States. And she is very, very much hates the NRA and wants to see gun, and she has never missed a week of her walking since she's been doing that. So she signed a commitment contract, put some money behind it. Now that's a kind of an extreme one, but there are other ways we can do it, just through a friend. I mean, a lot of my early morning runs, I don't, at 6 a.m., I do not want to run, I promise you. I mean, I want to be in bed with my wife, right? But I often meet a friend of mine who's a cardiologist, and he's at 6 a.m., and he doesn't want to be there either. But we kind of agreed the day before that we were going to meet each other at 6 a.m. To go for a run. And usually we're just like irritated at each other and we don't even speak for the first, 10 minutes. And then slowly we warm up, and I'm never unhappy that I did that run at the end. But I did it because I coerced myself through a commitment contract.
Yeah. very, very practical and pragmatic approach. I guess what you're saying is that the way we've typically encouraged physical activity has been, very prescriptive. You have to do this. If you don't do it, you're not really looking after yourself. You sort of have to rely. We're very much putting it down to individual motivation, individual willpower. And what you're saying, I guess, is that this is not working, right? We've not evolved to exercise. We're now living in a society where we simply don't have to anymore. That necessity has gone. So you need to find a way to make it necessary. And the way you found of doing it is you're meeting someone. So if your buddy has gone to the trouble of getting up early in the morning and goes to your agreed spot and you don't show up, there is a bit of, you have social pressure to show up, which is why so many movement programs talk about, doing it with other people, right? Because if you're leaving it up to yourself to motivate yourself, there's going to be times, I know when I got into parkrun, I remember thinking at the time I wasn't really a runner, right? And let me put that another way. I didn't perceive myself as a runner, whereas now I do, but I still went because I did it with my son. Is reason one. And reason two is there was this big community there, this really friendly community at parkrun. So I just had to make sure that my son and I were at the start line by 5 to 9 on a Saturday morning. And if I got there, I would complete a 5K. But if I had to do that myself, even if I had to do that myself with my son, I bet you some Saturdays we wouldn't do it. And so I think that accountability piece is I think it's really interesting. Now, you mentioned you're not a fan of coercion, yet you write a very surprising, certainly surprising to me, you write about, is it the Swedish, is it Bjorn Borg, the Swedish underwear, sportswear manufacturer? And I was mesmerized reading that story. So I wonder if you could tell that, and because that's actually taking quite a different approach, right?
Yeah, I had so much fun doing that. So I was thinking about this, because the last section of the book, the last quarter of the book, is really about how to apply the sort of natural history of exercise to the modern world. And I was interested in this idea of coercion, and I wanted to see if I could find an example of people who are forced to exercise, adults. I mean, we force kids to exercise in school, but nobody blinks an eye at that because we force kids to do all kinds of stuff and think it's totally acceptable. Because children can't make up children aren't responsible for their own decisions, but adults are. And as I was searching throughout the world, I was thinking about like monks in Asia who are forced to do things and whatever. And I wanted to, I'm very into participant observation. I like to try what I study. And so that's why I've tried barefoot running, and I tried it. That's why I've chased animals on, done races against horses, and I'm into that. I like.
And we're going to come to all that. Believe you me.
I like to put myself in the shoes of the people I'm studying, and so I found on the web a few articles about the Bjorn Borg company. It's a company in Sweden that makes mostly underwear, but other kinds of sports clothing. It's actually no longer owned by Bjorn Borg, but it's and how those companies have those like little contact me thing. So late at night, I remember telling my wife I'd found this company and I'd read some articles, and she said, "Well, contact them." So I got on the contact page and I said, "Dear Bjorn Borg company, I'm a professor at, whatever. I'm interested in this topic and I'm kind of curious to learn more." And I remember going to bed and saying to her, "I'm sure I'll never hear from them." And then the next morning in my inbox was an email saying, come and join Sports Hour. Come anytime you want. We'll be happy to show you. So I was on sabbatical and I had some time. So I got on an airplane and I went to they were very kind and they told me when to show up. So I showed up, and they basically said I could talk to anybody in the company, and I had to go to Sports Hour because at Bjorn Borg company, everybody has to exercise. It's a requirement, and there's a Sports Hour every Friday at, I think it's 10 a.m. and there's no excuses unless you're injured or whatever or something like that. If you're a board member, if you're a visitor, it doesn't matter who you are. If you sweep the floors, if you're the CEO, doesn't matter. You go to Sports Hour. And so I went to Sports Hour, which is a really hard kind of CrossFit workout. It was great. It was exhilarating. And you could do it as hard as you want or as light as you want. And then they have all kinds of other events where they, instead of a Christmas party, where everybody gets drunk, they run through the streets of Stockholm and have hot chocolate afterwards. I mean, it's a delightful environment, but of course, not everybody liked it, and some people left the company, but some people who are in the company love it. And I just talked to folks about it and see how it worked, and to my surprise, it was actually pretty popular, and the people actually kind of realized that it was a beneficial thing. But I should also say, these are people who've drunk the Kool-Aid, as we say in the United States, right? That, everybody who really hated it has obviously left the company. You wouldn't be in that company if you didn't think this was acceptable. But the fact of the matter is, that's, as far as I can tell, the only company in the world that does that. And we're not going to find, that's just not going to work in most places. And we have to find other ways to make exercise necessary.
Yeah, what's interesting about that company for me, and you're absolutely right, there's that inbuilt bias, isn't there? Because people, I guess some people, if they know that about the company and that's not their kind of thing, they may not even apply for a job in the first place. If they start working there and they think this is a good idea, but then they feel it's too much pressure, there's some sort of camaraderie that they don't like or they don't thrive on, they might leave. But it's an interesting model, and I appreciate this cannot be rolled out across society. There's a kind of ethical point there, I think, as well. But, I wonder what you think about the ethics of that, where a company says, hey, look, and again, I'm not speaking for that company because I don't know the ideology behind it, but let's say a company felt that, well, we know physical activity is important because it will help the employees, it will help them with their health and well-being, it's going to help them concentrate, focus, be more productive, it's a great way of bonding. I guess what would happen if companies some companies were like, well, look, this is part of the culture here, and if you want to work here, this is sort of what we would be supporting. It's quite a tricky one ethically, isn't it? Because it could be done in a way where it's very supportive, and it's like, well, if you just want to walk for that hour around the gym, that's fine. There's going to be no pressure on you from your manager or from the boss. I know you'd have to demonstrate that there was no discrimination by doing that, but it's working there. I mean, could that be you're saying that we need to take personalized approaches.
Well,
so could that work for some companies?
Well, I mean, let's flip the question and ask, did that used to work for some companies? So in the United States, as in every in Europe, universities are kind of like companies, and every university until recently required students to exercise. In the United States, physical activity, physical education was 100%. Every single university in the country, Harvard included, required physical education. Wow. And going back to the ancient Greek philosophers, and in the traditions in India and China, everywhere in the world where you had educational systems, which of course were for elite people, right? Because peasants didn't go to school, but wealthy aristocrats did. With no exception, exercise became part of people's education because people understood that there was a relationship between exercise and the body and the mind, right? Mental health and physical health, and that exercise is good for students. And that was dropped in the United States and starting basically in the 70s. So Harvard, for example, got rid of its physical education requirement in the 1970s. And now, we see the results, but these are adults, these are 18-plus-year-old people, and it was required. And so, I think this is, and of course, until recently, everybody had to be physically active to get to work. They had to, walk to get to work. They didn't have elevators to get them to their floor. We could go on with all the things that have changed in the world. So we've kind of shifted our workplace and shifted our schools without shifting the kind of how we approach our bodies. And so maybe Bjorn Borg company is going back to something very ancient in a new way. But the fact that we're so uncomfortable with it, I think, is interesting. We're just so worried about coercion and people's rights, and for good reason. But we're also, I think sometimes we also, I'm going to probably get myself in trouble now, but Look, I think it's, as you can already tell, I'm very opposed to body shaming and fitness shaming, right?
Yeah.
It's unacceptable. But sometimes I think because we're so worried about body shaming and fitness shaming, we go to the extreme and basically turn off the whole system.
Yeah.
And I wonder if we can't have our cake and eat it too, so to speak, right? Can we find a way to help people be physically active without engaging in body shaming, without engaging in fitness shaming? And I think we can. And again, I'm going to go back to my commitment contract model, because if, let's just say you're unfit, you're overweight, you're struggling, you hate to exercise, but you want to exercise. And if I told you you had to go to a CrossFit, workout every week and, do 150 burpees with this, highly muscled, nutcase in front of you who's your boss, you'd hate it, right? But if you could just walk 20 minutes a day, climb the stairs, right? Pick your own goal and work towards that, that would fit your fitness level, you could do it on your own, you could do it with friends, etc. Not in a way that is, we can find ways for people to be more physically active that can accommodate every disability, can accommodate every level of fitness, can accommodate, but we as a society, we've been very uncreative about it. We're not really willing to put in the time and the money and the effort to make it happen.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people get put off by gyms, for example. They've sort of been sold this idea that gyms, if I want to get fit, whatever their interpretation of fit is, I want to do my physical activity, then it has to be at the gym. It has to have a particular name. It has to have particular clothes that I wear, because if I don't, it doesn't count. And for me, as a doctor, I find myself trying to break down that barrier with patients all the time. I've often said, now I didn't know about these sort of tribes and these cultures for years who've danced, but I've often said to patients, look, do you like dancing? They go, yeah, I like dancing. I said, okay, well, let's start there. Why not, just before dinner every night for 10 minutes, have a dance in the kitchen, put on the tunes and dance. Go, yeah, but do I need something more? I said, well, let's start there. And I've seen families bond over it. I've seen people's mood get better just from the act of dancing every day. And, a lot of people are conditioned to think, oh no, it needs to have, I need to go to this particular class and then I need to buy the latest outfit. And
again, that's the commodification, commercialization of exercise, right? It's now a product and you have to spend money on it. And, you have to, and there are people there to advertise to us that, you can't run unless you wear these fancy shoes, and you have to have your fancy watch and all this sort of stuff. And frankly, I enjoy fancy shoes and my fancy watch when I go running, but we don't need it actually. Okay. And it works for some people, but it obviously is not working for everybody. And so, yeah, again, I think we need to kind of step back from our Western medicalized, commercialized attitude towards exercise and take a broader view, a broader perspective. And if we just simply do that, which is what my book tries to do, we'll come up with all kinds of other wonderful solutions. Dancing is just one of them. Going for walks with your like, why, for example, do we have so many boring meetings where we sit around in chairs, or now we sit glued to our bloody Zoom screens, right? Why can't we get up and walk, right? And have meetings on the hoof, right? There's so many examples of ways in which we could just encourage physical activity in a way that'll make it both necessary and fun.
Yeah. Now, Daniel, a lot of the research you did for this book has taken you to wonderful places around the world to do what sound like, from where I'm sitting, incredible things. In Tanzania, you've stayed with hunter-gatherer tribes. You've, I think, hunted kudu. You've ran with horses. And I'd love to sort of explore some of those, because these are things that many of us have never done. And I think there's something to be learned from that. So I was going to ask you, what has been some of the most surprising things that you've learned when you've gone and lived alongside indigenous tribes and communities? You've mentioned dancing. Did that surprise you? And was there anything else that you discovered that you didn't previously know?
Well, I mean, I'm a really lucky person. I'm such a, fortunate to have a great job that, I get paid to go have fun and travel around the world and study things that interest me. I'm a ridiculously lucky person. And I would say that, what surprised me the most is really, quite literally, it's the story I tell in the beginning of the book, which is, which is that people in these societies don't think what they're doing is exercise. And for me, that was the spark that started this book, because it was 2012 and I was finishing my previous book, which is called The Story of the Human Body. And in that book, the kind of message of that book is we didn't evolve to be healthy. And that book is about mismatched diseases, how the modern world that we're very poorly adapted to it in some respects, that get us sick in various ways. But so I was finishing up that book and I went to Highland, Mexico. So I went to the Ironman competition in Kona. This is a true story. I'm not exaggerating anything here. I was part of the medical conference that precedes this incredible race, which is just amazing. People do a 2.4 mile open water swim, then they do a 112 mile bicycle ride across the desert, and then they do a full marathon in like 90-degree heat. It's insane, right? And the people who win do it in like a little over 8 hours. I mean, they're like cyborgs. They're not real human beings. It's just it's astonishing. And then I got back, working on the book, and then went to Highland, Mexico, where I hired a guy to help me go to really, really remote areas to study the Tarahumara, who are sort of famous for their running. And I'd read about how they barefoot run and do these long distances. And what I discovered was that, first of all, I didn't see anybody running barefoot whatsoever anywhere. And I was traveling all over the place. And when I asked people about their running, they were like, well, people did run in these traditional races. But other than that, they didn't run. And I had this list of questions. Being a good anthropologist, I had a questionnaire, which I had, designed carefully. And one of the questions was, how do you train for your running? And my translator was struggling to figure out how to ask this question because there was no word for train in the Native American language, Roamari. And so she was trying to, you practice, she was trying to explain to these, and there was this one 70-something-year-old guy she asked, and I remember him because he was, I don't know, maybe the 10th or 12th person I was measuring and studying. And he was kind of a very serious fellow. He was a runner too, by the way. And the vast majority of people don't run very much. He was a runner, and he, through the translator, asked me, well, why would anybody run if they didn't have to? And at first I was thinking, this questionnaire I wrote is really bad. I wrote the wrong questionnaire, and then I realized, actually, this is telling me something that people there run when they need to, but exercise is just not part of their lexicon. Training is not part of their lexicon, and that kind of just permeated my brain as I started. I took every opportunity I could to do something where I was in the Western Ghats. We were looking for barefoot runners, and we were looking for people who were running there. We were been into Greenland and to various places in Africa, etc. Every place I've gone, I've noticed that people who are very physically active don't think of what they do in any way whatsoever as exercise. And to me, I think that's been most surprising. That was initially most surprising.
Yeah. It's very powerful, even though I've read that. To hear you explain it is very, very powerful because it gets to the heart of what the problem in society is about getting us to move more, right? It's like these communities don't have words for exercise or training. It just doesn't exist because I guess it's necessity driven.
Or it's really beautiful. The Tarahumara, when they run their long distance races, it's a form of prayer for them. To me, that's really beautiful. It's spiritual, right? They run because they believe it makes them closer to God. Yeah. What if we adopted that attitude, right? It's such a beautiful thought, right? And it does, right? And for them, actually, the concept of chase. Actually, I have one of the balls over here. Actually, this is one of the balls they use in their foot race. When they chase this ball, the ball gets dirty, etc., and it gets lost. And for them, the randomness is like a metaphor for life and for the vagaries of life, and it's really beautiful what they do. And that's true of a lot of the sacred dances that people do, And the list goes on.
Would they kick that ball around and follow it? Is that what would happen?
Yeah, they kind of flick it with their foot, and it as far as they can, and then they chase it and they find it again, and they flick it and they chase it and they find it and they flick it, and they'll do this. There are two teams doing this, and they'll do it until one team laps the other in a course.
Yeah.
And sometimes the race can be 10 miles, and sometimes the race can be 50 miles, and it, it depends on how they set up the race and what they agree on beforehand. And they're betting wildly, so it's a big social event, and it's fun. But it's also a form of prayer.
Yeah, this is something I explored in a conversation with Sanjay Rawal. I don't know how many episodes ago. He was the director on a film called 3100. If you've not seen it,
I've seen snippets of it, but I have not had a chance to sit down and watch the whole thing. But it's amazing.
Having read your book, I think I can almost guarantee you would love this documentary, because it's really, in many ways, showing tribes around the world how running is, it is about transcendence. It's a spiritual practice. It's not for calories burnt, how many miles have I gone, what did my heart rate do, all this kind of stuff that, again, nothing necessarily wrong with it. It's to get them closer to, I guess, being at one with the world, sort of finding themselves. And it's really, really interesting that, because the way we do it here in the West, by and large, and of course everyone is different, does seem to be quite far removed from that. It's interesting because you have been termed the barefoot professor in the past. And you mentioned when you went to Mexico, you didn't see that many people barefoot. I think you've been to other cultures like in Kenya and India where you have seen a lot of people barefoot. So what's the deal there?
Well, there's a story behind it if you have time.
I've got plenty of time, and this is probably one of the things I'm most interested in. So, and I've got the sort of professor of barefoot running in front of me. So you go as deep as you want here.
So here's the story. So in 2004, Dennis Bramble and I published the Born to Run paper. That was the title in Nature, Born to Run. And it was fun. I got invited to give all kinds of lectures, and I gave a lecture the night before the Boston Marathon. I think it was 2005. And it was a dark and stormy night, literally. I mean, there was an incredible rainstorm that came in just before the marathon. Everyone was worried about, the rain and all that. And it was a packed audience. And there was a guy sitting in the front row who I'll never forget him, because I remember he looked kind of like a bum from Harvard Square. And he had socks on that were wrapped in duct tape. And he was very intent on the lecture. And afterwards, he came up to me and asked, if people evolved to run, did they run barefoot? And is there any problem with that? And I said, well, of course they ran barefoot, because shoes were invented fairly recently. And I don't know really very much about barefoot running. But I realized so at the time we were studying head stabilization. Now, when you run, when your body hits the ground, your head jiggles, right? And we were interested in how the body stabilizes the head, how you prevent that jiggling from occurring so it doesn't blur your vision. And most of the runners we were looking at were heel strikers, right? They would land on their heel and their head would jiggle. And I remember there was a few runners occasionally who would come into the lab and they would be forefoot strikers. They'd land on the ball of their foot and their head wouldn't jiggle as much. And I remember thinking, they're like, you're ruining my experiment. And, because, we're not getting the head jiggling we wanted to measure. And so this guy comes in, and his name is Barefoot Jeffrey. And he owns a bicycle shop here in the area. And he came in and we set up, the equipment, and he just ran light as a feather. No head jiggling whatsoever. And he landed on the ball of his foot. And I asked him why he landed on the ball of his foot. And he said, well, it doesn't hurt. If you land on your heel, it hurts. And so we started doing some experiments and realized that that's how people ran when they barefoot. You can't slam into the ground like you can in a shoe because you have all that cushioning in the shoe. You have to run lightly and gently. And so we got to studying barefoot running. And of course, I've been working in Africa for many decades. And I've seen people in Africa, running barefoot, but I'd never really measured them. So we went out and started measuring them and, published another paper in Nature about the biomechanics of barefoot running. But I always like to try what I study. And we realized that to me, it's not about whether you're barefoot or not. To me, it's about how you run. To me, running is a skill, just like swimming or climbing a tree or many of the other things that we do. And there are better and worse ways to run. And what barefoot running does is that it helps us learn the skill of running. that I think there are advantages to not crashing into the ground and relying on some technology in your shoe to make that comfortable. And so to me, it's not about, to me, I think, you can run beautifully in shoes and you can run terribly in shoes. And you can run beautifully barefoot and you can run terribly barefoot. But what really matters is how you run, and that barefoot running gives us information. And sure, shoes are comfortable. And I mostly wear shoes when I run. I also wear minimal shoes. And I agree with everything you just said. You can't just throw away your shoes or transition your shoes and immediately change your gait. You have to transition gradually and slowly, and you have to learn the skill of running. But if you do, the evidence suggests that there's a lot of benefits, and you don't destroy your knees, and you can do all kinds of good things with your body. And there's a lot of evidence, and there's mounting evidence, I think, that supports that. But of course, it's still controversial because there's a lot of money in the shoe industry, and there are people who like what they do, and they get upset if you tell them that they should be doing something different. And for many of them, they shouldn't. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. But many people are injured, and they might benefit from changing the way they run.
Yeah, I mean, that certainly echoes what I've seen in my clinical experience. And even a really good friend of mine, actually, who has very much been enamored with my journey to minimalist shoes, he sort of transitioned to pretty much everything apart from running until maybe 6 months ago. He'd wear minimalist shoes for work, for walking, for going out with his family at the weekends. And he really liked the connection it gave him. And he sort of felt he was moving differently. But he said, I've got no real reason to change the way I run because I can do it. I don't get injured. But something changed about 6 months ago. I think just on that journey, he was quite interested to go, well, what is it like if I actually try running? So he went super slow. He could only do 3 or 4K, I think, initially. But now he's a badge wearing sort of barefoot runner. And I think all these things become quite reductionist, don't they? It's like barefoot running, good or bad. Minimal shoes, good or bad. It's like, well, it kind of depends on the context a little bit, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And almost all the world's best runners have what I call a barefoot style. And yet it's funny that there's some people get really mad. Like you tell me I have to be a 4-foot striker. It's like, no, you don't have to be a 4-foot striker. But some of the world's best runners are 4-foot strikers. You might, there's nothing wrong with it. So people are very, people are tribal, right? Just like in the United States, you've got the Republicans versus Democrats, and 4-foot strikers versus rear-foot strikers. It's crazy. I think actually, it's interesting. People often ask me what kind of shoes I wear. Well, I wear many different kinds of shoes. Today I wore one pair, but tomorrow I'll probably wear something other. Maybe Thursday I'll go barefoot. I mean, why do we have to categorize ourselves and just do one thing? It's a fascinating insight. The other thing that's interesting to me about barefoot running is how out of touch we are with our bodies. A lot of people, the idea just makes them cringe. Like, are you serious? I mean, well, you're going to cut your feet. What about all the hypodermic needles and glass out there? And, I've heard it all, right? And all these people haven't tried. They have no idea. And, I think everybody should just try. Just, go for a few hundred meters, take your shoes off and run for just a few hundred meters down a street. Don't make sure it's a smooth street, and, don't do it at night so you can see the glass and the hypodermic needles, depending on where you live, right? But you'll discover that it's actually kind of fun. But don't do too much too fast, because you will injure yourself if you do too much too fast. But people are just out of touch with how their bodies work.
I guess even just if people are lucky enough to have a garden or a backyard, even just start by walking in your backyard or garden, just get used to that feeling again. It's always fascinated me. So my parents are immigrants from India to the UK. My dad came over in the early 1960s. And, in Asian culture, certainly in Indian culture, you don't wear shoes inside the house, right? It's just not done. So I grew up, we never wore shoes inside the house. We'd always leave it outside or in the porch. Then you go in either in your socks or barefoot. And it's only, when you get older and you start interacting with your friends and go around to their houses, I remember thinking, oh, well, these guys wear shoes in their house. Oh, wow. Because my norm was that you don't wear shoes in your house. And it's just interesting how culturally things are different. I'm not saying that necessarily plays out as we get older, but it is interesting that I've certainly noticed in some of my friends growing up. One of my best mates in particular, I remember he, even at university going around, he'd always like getting ready in the morning, having a shower, shaving, would be putting his shoes on, even if he was inside the house. And I guess culturally, these things are different. I remember going to India every other summer when I was a kid. We used to go to a city called Kolkata, or what used to be called Calcutta, for 6 weeks. And I remember playing with my cousins, and my cousin, who was about 4 years younger than me, he'd always want me to come and play football. And we'd go down to the apartment, just underneath all the apartments, there was a bit of land, and they were all playing barefoot, like properly tackling, going in hard. And I started playing it. I found it really difficult at first, but by the end of the summer, you're used to it. So
Sure.
It's different everywhere, right? In terms of how much they actually wear shoes.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I've also had those experiences. I obviously haven't gone to India as much as you have, but I've had those experiences. And actually, one of my favorite moments was playing. I didn't make it into the book, but I remember playing cricket with a bunch of kids in a tiny little village in the Ghat Mountains. And what was terrifying was not being barefoot. It was those bowlers. Boy, they were terrifying. But the way in which but you used a very important term there, which is these cultural ideals, and they translate into so many other ways in which we use our bodies. So another example is sitting or sleeping, right? The idea that it's, that this, one of the Western ideas we have is that you should sleep in a quiet, dark room with a soft, comfortable mattress with nobody around you and no sound and no light and no nothing, in this kind of, stimulus-free environment. That's a cultural norm too, right? And until recently, even in the West, nobody did that, right? And yet people feel like they can't sleep properly unless they're in that kind of environment, which is again, it's what you get used to. It's a cultural norm. And then if you're not in that kind of environment, then you get stressed and your cortisol levels go up because you're anxious about sleep. And of course that prevents you from sleeping in the first place. How we sit, like we're told, we have to sit in a chair with a particular posture. That's also a cultural norm that's completely made up in the 19th century by German orthopedic surgeons who for some reason opined that when you sit, you should have the same curvature in your spine as when you stand. There's no evidence to support that whatsoever. It's completely made up. And in fact, there's plenty of evidence that doesn't support that. I could go on. We have all kinds of cultural norms that there's nothing wrong with them because you can't not have a culture. I mean, we all grew up in a particular culture, but sometimes we need to step back from what we're told and question it, or ask, does that work for me? Particularly in our modern world, in which often it doesn't.
If you want to see the recent one-on-one conversation I had with the inspirational Dr. Gabor Mate, it's a great conversation. I really think you're going to enjoy it. You can check it out right there.
But much of physical pathology can be traced to childhood experiences and how we cope with those experiences and what those experiences did